All right, it is April 11. We've got a full agenda today. So thanks everyone for coming out. This is the Gateway API meeting for April 11. I see some new names to me, at least. I think if anyone does feel like they want to introduce themselves, we'd love to find new faces and see what brings you here, but also no pressure if not. But we're always happy to have more people at this meeting and taking part in Gateway API and contributing. Cool. Okay. So first off, I should say this is Gateway API community meeting. It's very informal. We have an agenda here that anyone can edit. So please feel free if you want to add things. But first off on this list is Mike, and I think you're here. So feel free to start us off with reference policy things.
All right. So yeah, this is something that I ran into when implementing support for reference policy. I was initially thinking of the case where resources are modified after a route is initially accepted. But one of the Contour maintainers also pointed out that their implementation differs from what I proposed in the conformance test for how a route should initially be treated as accepted and routing traffic when a backend ref in the route may not have permission granted through a reference policy. So, and then it's potentially more complicated if resources are modified, if a route should ever become unattached when it's modified or when a reference policy is modified, or if traffic should default to 503 errors, as is mentioned in some places in the spec. The spec, I think, is contradictory around this. There's some parts that say invalid resources should not be accepted, and there's other parts that say traffic to invalid backends should give a 503 response. So basically just open this topic of discussion. Would love to hear from other implementations, other maintainers in terms of how y'all are approaching this and try to get some consensus on what is correct or we should be checking for conformance purposes.
Just to make sure I have the question correct here, this is in the case where reference policy allowed a reference initially, or allowed this cross namespace reference to exist, and then that reference policy that allowed it is modified or deleted in some way that no longer allows that to exist. What do we do in that state?
Yeah, that was my initial case. One of the Contour maintainers, Chris, I think, also mentioned that they do allow a route to be accepted if one of the backends is not permitted initially, but just 503 the traffic to it.
Accepted, but getting it. So accepted, but not routable. So accepted, and
yes,
you're returning 503. Okay.
Yes.
That seems contradictory. So the status for the route is accepted, but the route will serve nothing but 503s.
It's mostly, I think, in the case of multiple backends where one may be valid, one or more may be valid, but at least one is potentially invalid. So think of like a V1, V2 split, something like that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's tricky. And let me pause. I should let anyone else speak before I say what I'm thinking. Okay, I'll go for it. So with that, I think what we've done elsewhere in our API is maybe a little bit. I think the most relevant thing here would be the allowed routes on Gateway, right? Where we have that same kind of cross namespace allowance from Gateway to a route. And in that case, when that is no longer allowed, I can't remember our guidance, but it feels like we should be doing the same thing in both cases And I feel like it is to drop that route and consider it no longer attached to the gateway. I'm not exactly sure.
That's the trickiest part, is like if you modify a resource and maybe it's only 5% of the traffic is pointing to an invalid destination, would you end up dropping an entire route that 95% of the traffic is active? Because that seems risky.
We've had a similar conversation before, and the problem is it's very difficult to define that appropriate threshold, right? Because what if it's the other way and you've got a backend that's used to handling 1% of traffic, and you send all your traffic to your canary backend for, you know, whatever reason. Yeah. Huh. Jeff, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One is, I think there's two different issues here. One is with a route when you've got some of the backends available and some not. From a policy point of view, what do you do with the route? And I'm not sure the answer on that one from my perspective. I think that the second issue, though, that Mike's getting at is, what if everything's fine? I've got a functioning route and backends and everything, and then the administrators of the namespace that the resources are in, the backend reference to, they change the reference policy and no longer allow that gateway to access those resources. What's our behavior? Is it like with a gateway class where we don't change it once it's been put in place, or is it dynamic and we would stop sending traffic to those backends? I think, sorry, Rob. I think it needs to be dynamic, where we stop sending traffic to those resources, because there is a security implication here.
I guess I think my core consideration is there's two different ways to stop sending traffic. One of them is to start responding with 503s. The other is to entirely detach the route. And I think that's kind of my core question, is what's the behavior that's expected?
So in that very specific example of, you have you're splitting traffic between two backends. One is in another namespace. That one in another namespace is no longer valid, but you still have one valid backend. Do you just send 503s to the invalid backend now, or to request that would have ended up on that invalid backend? Or do you just drop the entire route? And yeah, I want to back up one more step and agree with Jeff that this should be dynamic, that this is a security thing. And if someone removes a reference policy, we don't want that access to persist indefinitely. Like we want that to be an immediate, as close to immediate response as possible. I think, thank you for whoever's taking notes. I think related to that, it may be practical or wise to consider a finalizer pattern here of, this reference policy is being used to grant access to some set of resources, and I'm going to drop a finalizer on it, and I'll remove the finalizer as long as this is no longer relevant for my implementation. This, again, that doesn't change the end result. It just makes it a little bit harder to have accidents, because the accidental deletion of a reference policy here is potentially very painful. As to your question, Mike, I'm not sure how many, I'm not sure. I don't think we have any prior art for the idea of saying that, you know, in this traffic splitting scenario that 99% of responses need to be 503 and 1% can go to a valid backend, or, you know, like splitting between an error result and a actual backend routing. I think this deserves more. I don't feel like I am qualified to answer this on my own. I'm interested in what others say on this call too. But we may need to bring this out to a GitHub issue discussion, etc., just for that specific question. Any other thoughts from other implementers?
So hi, I'm Travis. I work on the calling team with Shane. And this kind of just was something I was looking at today. I kind of agree so far with all the stuff of like, should it be dynamic or not? It should, like, that's kind of the way that our implementation is going to work inherently anyway. If we get a change, we're going to rescan all of the objects to see if they can still apply. And I think we really need to do that. Like, otherwise you would not be able to like add a reference policy in the middle of operation either. And that seems a bit, you know, not what you want. As far as the other part for whether it gets like partial support or not, I forget offhand like what we actually do. I think in our case, if like there's a specific rule we cannot handle, if like we will generate, you know, the remaining rules that we can handle without any issues or not. But I mean, that's kind of the way that we would do it. Like if we wanted to get partial support, we would generate any rule that we could, and like log in any that we could not. What's the other part I was going to say here? Thing I was looking at for this is that ideally we would kind of want to just say at like edit time, if this makes any difference, like, you know, kick it back out to the user and say like, you know, what you requested isn't possible. But that becomes a bit difficult here because it's not something we can do with a single resource, the admission controller. Like it has to do cross resource lookups to like check both the reference policy and the HTTP route or whatever. Because we can do stuff when we reject stuff in the middle, but it's not as user friendly because you have to like go look in logs to see like what actually got rejected.
Yeah, great thoughts. And I agree that it would be nice if we could reject immediately. Every time I've tried to push for cross resource validation upstream, it's gotten shot down pretty quickly, just because it's so hard to guarantee order of operations, and you very likely end up preventing, you know, valid configuration that just came in out of order or something like that. Yeah, I wish we could find a way to provide immediate validation here, and maybe there's something, but I agree with everything you're saying here.
A quick question for someone who knows the answer to this. Mike mentioned something about reconciliation at the top. Does that mean that that there's an operator that's examining the status of the backend, of all the multiple backends that might be attached to this route, that might be able to mark it as degraded or, you know, not quite ready for, you know, in some way not quite a valid route?
I don't think
that
that's a good question. I don't think we've defined any kind of standard guidance or suggestion to do that. Yeah, what I think, Mike, you may be the one taking notes. I think you're suggesting, yeah, that the resolve ref status of we already have all of this conversation seems to overlap with any other instance where a backend ref is invalid, right? So someone makes a typo in their backend ref and it references just a service that doesn't exist because the name's wrong or something like that. So we do have a more generic set of guidance for what happens when you refer to something that doesn't exist. And I think this is awfully similar to that. But maybe I didn't completely understand your question, but I think you're talking about like a generic controller pattern of marking a route as degraded. Is that? I'm not sure.
Yes, I just don't know. I haven't investigated closely enough to see if reference policy is, I mean, if routes are something that are reconciled along with the status of reference policies. So yes, I guess it would be just a generic pattern.
Yeah, no, I think we have a pattern that is too generic right now. The docs, you know, the docs for even resolved refs or even a missing backend ref or a invalid backend ref are not clear what what an implementation is supposed to do. So yeah, we need some kind of more well-defined pattern than we have today for what that can be. I think part of what has prevented this from happening so far is, in some cases we just say, well, whatever the implementation has when there's no routing is what happens, which there's some variation, I would imagine. This feels different than that. Yeah, I think this is a big enough conversation that it merits an issue. Unless, Mike, you linked to something, but it looks like just a comment on a PR.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a PR comment that kind of prompted me to reconsider the initial acceptance of it, in addition to kind of the life cycle conditions that could cause a situation like this. But yeah, I can definitely write this up as a GitHub issue. That seems like a reasonable next step.
Cool. And Candice, I'm not sure, did we answer your question or just make it more confusing?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'll look into it more on my own. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Any additional comments on reference on this question? All right, well, thanks for bringing this up. Reference policy is one of those things that I think is both very exciting about our API, but also needs more more thorough documentation and implementation guidelines. So thanks for pushing this forward. I really appreciate the upcoming tests, conformance tests for reference policy. It's going to be very, very helpful. Yeah. Okay, so Milestone. I pulled this, so I always try and add, just to try and keep a focus on V1 Beta 1 because that's our next release. Want to make sure we're still making progress towards it. And so I always add an item for that. And I pulled an item in from the last meeting because I don't think we actually discussed this last time, Mike, but you had an item on the agenda that got, I think, missed, or I just forgot about it, but renaming the default branch from master to main. I know I talked individually with Nick about that. He was very much on board. I think Nick actually suggested it and I was on board. Either way, big fan of the idea. Just no one has volunteered and we haven't tracked it anywhere. I linked the official guidance of what needs to be done. I'm supportive, but I don't currently have the time myself. But maybe if there's enough interest, we could at least have an issue to track that this is something we want to do. And if someone wants to, does anyone have time? Mike, is this something you're interested in working on as well, or just I know, I'm sure you have plenty.
I probably have my plate full with reference policy stuff, but it's something that I would love to see happen before we go to beta.
Yeah. I am in a similar place of I would love to see this happen, but my plate is also more full than I would like to admit. So at the very least, I think this is something we should add to an issue and say if someone is interested in working on this, here's how it would happen. And there's, I think, broad support from project maintainers to move forward with it if anyone has time to make it happen. Yeah. So I can follow up and create an actual issue to track this, and definitely this is one of those areas where if you are wanting to get involved, contribute to the project, we're always looking for additional contributors here. Cool. All right, so next one is API review. One of the things in the, I kind of skipped over the V1 Beta 1 milestone. Sorry for that. There are a few things going on in V1 Beta 1 milestone. We're still at the same spot of almost entirely focused on documentation and yeah, basically entirely focused on documentation and webhook things. I did raise a bug the other day that I found going through API review myself, and this just does not seem accurate. We had a gateway spec addresses that was listed as core support. It did not seem like many implementations could support this. So anyway, there's a PR that will switch this to extended. I don't even know that this is an API change so much as just a clarification. But that's one thing that got added to the milestone in the past week. You notice that we have many of these. There are PRs that will close them out soon, but there are still some things that we need a bit more work on. But again, documentation and webhooks, I don't think we have API changes pending here. If there's anything that you really want to make sure is included or fixed in V1 Beta 1, please raise it now or soon, just so we don't, graduate resources to beta and regret having something in here. Once we do get to beta, the resources we've graduated, the fields that are in those resources are basically locked. We can do some basic changes, we can add things, but we can't really remove things or make significant modifications to what already exists, just add more things on top. Yeah. Okay, so related to all that,
Rob?
Yeah.
Rob, on the gateway spec address, I mean, I'd agree with you. Seems like this shouldn't be core, it should be extended. Do we need to do anything other than just get a PR for this?
Yeah, there's already a PR.
Okay.
What we do need is a release note, just, and we'll make sure it's part of our change log. This is one that could probably be cherry picked back as a patch release. I look at it as more of a clarification. I don't think any implementation out there really looked at that and said, oh, this should be core, because it's frankly not supportable by enough that, yeah. Yep. So I think of it as a clarification or bug fix primarily. Yeah. Okay, so great question. Thank you. One of the key things in V1 Beta 1 that did make progress last week was going through API review. The last API review session that we had with SIG network reviewers, I just set up some time on Friday and had time where any API reviewer could chat with me and work through any API issues. Anyone is welcome to attend these, but it's so hard to find the logistics of scheduling things with larger groups of people. Tim showed up for this review. I expect I'll have additional review sessions. If anyone is interested in being part of that, by all means, you're welcome. With that said, this is just Tim left some comments on this review, on this PR, and some of them I wanted to highlight here. Okay, one of them was mine. This one I'm going to cover shortly. Another one I kind of chatted with Shane about a little bit, and Tim had a few questions that I am unfortunately not equipped to answer, because it feels like so long since we did the address matching that I didn't have a clear answer for him about source addresses in TCP and UDP routes. I think the reason we added source addresses as well as destination addresses is just that it was something that was theoretically useful. But it was, I'm not sure if the intent was purely matching or if we were starting to overlap with firewall.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If my memory serves, I actually intentionally left out source addresses in the PR that I did. I believe somebody else added destination. I can still help out and like try to make some sense of that situation, but I'm not. I get the questions. I understand the questions completely. So I'll take a look at it and kind of
Okay, yeah,
work with the people
that's
who did
good.
it.
I need to look back through this too and find the history. But you're
Pretty
so
sure
Shane,
it was a second PR, a follow-up PR that added the source ones. Pretty sure about it, but
so first PR was dest, and then second was source addresses, and source addresses are less. Yeah, okay. That would make sense.
GEP originally, I didn't see a specific use case, and I really didn't want to add something I didn't have a specific use case for.
Yeah, no, I get that. I get that. Yeah, well, we'll have to look back to the history, but this is one that I just didn't have a good answer to yet. So if anyone does remember context or has a clear use case for it, definitely speak up. If not, it sounds like there's not a lot of people that are really, needing this specific feature. So in general, when there's a lack of that, we may just cut it from the release.
There's actually a pretty good use case for this, and it's when you need to block specific resources from like a country, which is not uncommon. You like they can look at your web page and stuff, but they can't download your software, kind of thing. So it's going to be you have to make a decision based off of what URL is trying to be accessed and whether or not that source IP address is allowed to access that resource. So that's a fairly common use case that I've seen.
Yeah, that's true, and actually that was fathomed when we originally wrote the GEP. It was, but the problem being in its current state, there's no sitter support for a type. So I think that reduces that use case quite a bit by having to put in like every IP address of a country, of course.
Good point.
So that's something that like I do think I thought originally eventually that would be the main use case for source, but I just didn't need it, so I didn't put it in. But in its current state, I don't think that one's going to work, unfortunately, because unless we go ahead and we just push to add sitter, which is a pretty straightforward change. And if somebody's like really in favor of this, I'd be like, yeah, just add the sitter support.
I think that's a good point. What Tim specifically was calling out here is that what we say right now in source addresses is unclear. It doesn't say that we're dropping, traffic that doesn't match. It seems to indicate we're just ignoring it and letting it continue through matching, which is inherently different than, for example, what we have, I forget the specific name of the field on service type load balancer of source IP ranges, basically. Where that behavior is if you're not in that range, you're dropped, you're explicitly dropped. And here we're just, the description is pretty vague, but it seems like what we're suggesting is we just ignore it and let it continue to see if
it's an
anything
or
else
match.
matches.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I think it's unclear here and we need to revisit it. And yeah, like you said, Shane, we should just go back through the history and figure out at what point we added this, and maybe we can find some more context on why we added it. And the thing is, it very well could have come from me. It's been so long, I don't remember. But anyway, that's just the thing. So if anyone does have a clear use case, let us know. Otherwise, we'll just try and figure out what our original use case was. Okay, and then he had a similar question for destination address matching. I think destination address matching is clearer to describe the use cases for, but it is still admittedly hard to understand. when combined with a gateway. But I'm interested if anyone else can help add use cases here, or for, you know, I did a first shot at like the 2 use cases I'm familiar with, but maybe others can add or better explain those use cases. I think someone was about to say something. I cut them off. Okay. So yeah, if this is a feature you're interested in, the one that I am less, I think this is a real use case, the you know, further filtering based on destination address, but it's not as obvious as some of our other, much of our other routing config. So yeah. Okay. And the rest, yeah, that's about it. Any comments, follow up on these things? This is 1086. If anyone wants to help keep an eye on this PR, I expect we'll be getting some additional feedback in the coming days. So if anyone can help with responses, maybe follow up changes, whatever's needed, that would be great. And yes, this discussion with Tim led to a thread on the Kubernetes API reviewers mailing list, which I've linked in the agenda. And that is really this pattern we have all throughout our API is we have a type and a value field, right? So you think of path matching. We have type, prefix, value, /foo as an example, right? And that's fine. Tim was questioning if that was really scalable, and what it came in the context of is the changes I made related to rewrites and redirects. And that mailing list, you feel free to read through the thread, but I tried to summarize it here. One, union discriminator is still recommended. It sounds like gone back and forth in Kubernetes API conventions, but recommendation is still to use that. But the difference is there's a preference to use unique fields instead of a type and address, a type and value type pattern that we've used in many places in our API. So instead you would have a type, address type, and then IP, CIDR, hostname, you know, a separate field per address type. And so this is very similar to the pattern we're already using for filters, but suggesting using it in more places, or at least new places as we add them. And redirects or rewrites came up because that's another thing that was following that pattern. This allows for better validation. It allows for in the future, like specifically why Tim asked about this, I think there's a comment on the PR too, is in our path replacement logic, there is future room for a substitution, right? So you have a type, a value, and then at some point in the future, you may want to say, I specifically want to substitute this part of the path. And that field would only be valid for some address types. And Tim's suggestion was, well, instead of that, why don't you leave yourself more room and have a allow for a struct type. So you have, okay, a type of, we'll just say rewrite type here. And one of them is substitution. And instead of just a string, it's a struct. If I can spell the day. And then you have a little bit more room to work within that structure. So that is a high level pattern that came out of that thread. I think that may lead to more broad changes, or at least changes for how we add things in the future. But also that's API reviewers thread, so you're welcome to respond if you have questions, comments, thoughts, whatever. There's only a couple, 3 different things in here so far. Yeah. but I think that is a good bit of feedback and something that we should probably adjust towards as we're going forward with this API design. Any comments or questions about that feedback or that direction? Okay, cool. I think we're on to the last thing then, and that is conformance test organization. I had a conversation with someone internally that I work with who's been running conformance tests with us against our implementation. And they were talking about all the gaps. They helped identify all the gaps in our current conformance tests, which I recognize our conformance tests are not in any way exhaustive right now, but it seemed like it would be helpful to at least have a path forward to understand the gaps and document the gaps in our conformance tests right now. So I made a very rough attempt at organizing these. This is actually, I think, Jeff, you had a comment asking about this a couple of weeks ago. So very related to that too. So I have an area conformance label now, and I'll just drop into one of these to give a rough idea of what they look like. And in this case, Mike, you're working on a PR that I think will knock off all of the things for route to service. And then we still have more for gateway to secret. And we should probably still add additional tests here. This is just my run through the API. Here's the things I know we need to have coverage for. But if you come up with more things, don't hesitate to add to this list or add new issues, etc. What I'm really hoping to get out of this is some idea of who can help write conformance tests, because this is a large project, and it's also one that is easily distributed. It's one where anyone on this meeting can say, hey, I want to contribute this one test. I want to contribute a test that covers cross namespace reference is not allowed by a reference policy from gateway to secret. And that's all. If that's something you are able or interested in contributing, that would be really helpful. This again is just a way of trying to structure and get some organization around who's taking on these tests. Jeff, I know you'd mentioned you'd been working, or your team had been working on some additional conformance tests. Is there any overlap with the tests the tests I've described in any of these issues, and what might be coming from your team?
Well, there's the reference policy
Yes,
that Mike's
yes.
checked in.
Yes.
I don't know off the top of my head what else we've got in plan that we haven't already checked in. I mean, we've got, I think, at least 2 PRs that are outstanding for conformance tests that that we're wanting to contribute.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, and I would love to get to a place where every implementation has contributed, a subset, even just one conformance test, but just to have a truly broad set of contributors to our conformance test, because not only do we want everyone to pass conformance tests, but we want everyone to have a shared understanding of what to have contributed to the definition of conformance. So we're all invested in the same definition. Yeah, I know I have plans to help out with some of these myself. I think I chatted with the person who's been helping us with our docs review, Meha. She has been volunteered to start on one test from one of these items. But again, this is not meant to be, I know this is an overwhelming list, but this is not meant to be, you have to solve everything in one go. It's there's lots of small little pieces to this, and you can just pick a tiny little piece and work on that. I think that the matching is a good example of, we have an example test for what it looks like for prefix matching. If you take that same pattern and use it for exact path matching or header matching, it should be a fairly good starting point. Just reading a comment from Mike, you're saying you may be able to help with the other set of reference policy tests, the gateway to secret ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Cool. Is anyone else interested in contributing to conformance tests?
I'm interested.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. Well, definitely, message anyone on Slack, drop something in the main SIG Network Gateway API channel. I know I've just kind of, what I think I probably need a better starting point of here's how you write a conformance test and here's how you run it. But in lieu of that, don't hesitate to just ask questions, because I'll always want to make it help people getting started with contributing to the API. Yeah. Thanks for being interested. Cool, and same goes for anyone else. Don't hesitate to reach out. And in the meantime, I will try to have a slightly clearer definition of what it looks like to add additional tests. I will point out that Mike's PR somewhere down here is a great one for reference, and I've lost track of it. Oh yes, here it is. Thank you, Mike, for adding conformance tests. This is a really good example. This adds several conformance tests, so you don't need to have a PR quite this big, but this is a great example of how to do it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you again for taking notes. And with that, are there anything else on the agenda that we should cover? Otherwise, I'll get into just a bit of PR and issue triage. Cool. Okay, just I don't think there's much. Oh, there's a brand new one. Thank you, Mike. Or not a new one, just yes, this is the one that we just discussed. Thank you. This all makes sense. No, we didn't even discuss this. So Mike, maybe you can explain. Sorry.
Oh, this is just something that we've noticed while going through the route status stuff, is that route condition reason is actually not in the API spec yet.
Yeah.
The type exists, but the docs don't. It's something that we can probably add quick.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. It looks like everything else is a little bit older here. So I'm going to let this one stay. And then for pull requests, I think I have touched on everything pretty recently. If I've missed your PR or if someone else has missed your PR, like if you are needing feedback on a PR that you've written, please ping any one of the maintainers in Slack. I know that we're all busy and miss things. So if we have missed a PR, definitely let us know. I know several of the maintainers, including myself, are going to be out of the office for the rest of the week. So not purely coincidental, but a lot of us chose to take this week off. So I'll be out for a good chunk of this week. But yeah, don't hesitate if you feel like your PR has been missed. It probably has. So add a comment, add something in Slack, and we'll make sure someone looks at it.
Well, does it help if people who aren't maintainers review and do an LG? Looks good to me. Yes,
please. And I've been meaning to say that. Thank you. Yes. Every review is helpful here. So we have a formal maintainer role, but it doesn't really, all that limits is who can hit the final approve, but it is incredibly helpful to have lots of people contributing reviews, because this relatively small set of maintainers can only do so much, and we want everyone to feel like they have ownership in this project and feedback and can really make a difference. I've seen some great reviews on some of these conformance tests by other people, and yes, please feel empowered and to review these PRs, and all feedback is valuable and helpful. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. Cool. I think that's all we have for today. Any last things, or should we get another 10, 12 minutes back?
Just kind of put in a plug here for the route inclusion delegation GEP. The documents, the GEP document itself is up there. I actually updated it this morning because Nick rewrote his the route status section, and so I merged his changes in, and those are there. So that section is no longer, a draft from his perspective. And so far, I think Rob is the only one who's reviewed and made comments, which thank you very much, Rob. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is an absolutely massive gap. I appreciate the efforts here, and this is a perfect example of where additional reviews would be very helpful, because it's hard for any individual reviewer to catch everything or to really understand everything, but especially if you're thinking about implementing this API, if you can take a minute to look through here and say, oh, this would be really annoying to implement, or or if you're planning on using this API, oh, this would be confusing to use. These kinds of feedback, those kinds of feedback would be very helpful. Route inclusion and delegation is, at least from what we've heard from Contour team, something like that is very easy to turn into a very complicated thing to develop and implement. And you can end up regretting different parts of the API if you're not very, very careful. So this is one I want to make sure we have as many reviews as possible, and we've thought of every little edge case. I know, like, looking at the size of this gap already, it's, I think, probably our most detailed gap ever. So thank you. I think that it is already very well thought out. But again, additional feedback to help us catch things now before we merge it and make it an official Kubernetes API will be very, very helpful and appreciated.
If we can just get a few more lines of stuff that we need to add into there, it'll be over 1,000 lines. Really
I have a feeling we're headed in that direction.
Yeah, same here.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Again, that's PR 1085, and any and all feedback is very welcome on this one. But with that, I think we've got everything for today. So have a great rest of your Monday, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you.